has the way that we provide readiness information to NATO changed since the NFM? No, because NATO's assessments of readiness and capability are run through the NATO defence planning process. That is a biannual cycle. The last time that we went through that process and the information provided is classified was in 2021. We'll expect another assessment in 2023. We provide offers to NATO against the NATO force model, against a variety of tiers of readiness and categories of how committed they are, and those will then be assessed through either TAC evals, tactical evaluations, or combat readiness evaluations, and we're in the process of going through that.
Okay, and would you think there would be any worth of the tactical evaluation process formerly used could be brought back into use at all, or you don't see that as being of any future benefit at all? Richard?
You Army first.
I'll talk about, we go through combat, so they're slightly different for the Royal Air Force and for the air domain and the land domain. In the land domain we have combat readiness evaluation, and those have not stopped. So to give you an example, headquarters of the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps has just been through its CRAVAL. The contribution that we make currently to the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, soon to become the ARF, has been through a CRAVAL process. Headquarters, the 1st Division, who provide the headquarters for the ARF, is about to go through it. And in each of those cases we've received, well, for those who've been through, largely very, very positive reports and commenting on a lot of best practice for the rest of the Alliance.
So two things. Firstly, in terms of evaluations, yes, they do happen. So, for example, this year, the NATO headquarters Air Command came and did its evaluation of the C-17. There's the NATO TAC Eval conference this month, where our operational training centre will go to make sure it's assessing the likes of the Typhoon Force for its pre-deployment training prior to its air policing role. The Typhoon Force was relatively recently been through an evaluation, and as Patrick describes, actually the reports we get back are very positive. I think what you might be driving at is whether the NATO force model has changed the ask of the armed forces across the Allies, and that is true. So the fundamental purpose of the NATO force model is to improve the readiness of the forces and to provide SACEUR with more forces at its fingertips in order to enhance the deterrent effect and to react to events that might occur in Europe. And so as a consequence, NATO is particularly interested in the readiness states of the forces that it has right across the alliance. And it does, part of the way it does that is through the evaluation, part of it is through the information we provide through the NATO defence planning process, and in response to the NATO's force model, force sensing and force attribution work that we do.
Just a sort of slight supplementary, because Rich has triggered my mind. So if you look, for example, at the forward land forces, so those forward elements that we're committed to in our case in Estonia, there is now a process in NATO where that will be subject to a more rigorous examination that has happened previously, and we're going through that at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
That TAC eval process that you referred to for the Typhoon Force was for the Li-Ming 135 VAW force, wasn't it?
So that was actually for the Expeditionary Air Wing before it went out, but prior to that the Typhoon Force has been through evaluations, as have other forces that we attribute to NATO.
And was that for air policing? I'm conscious that was an air policing mission. What I'm interested in is complex air operations against a peer adversary. What about a TAC eval for that?
So the evaluation that's undertaken will be the evaluation that's undertaken for a specific operation, which will be about ensuring that the pre-deployment training is adequate. That will be done by us and then affirmed with NATO. More generally, the forces and the C-17 force, having been through this evaluation, would have looked at the full range of the capabilities that it's required to deliver. And so NATO is assessing the forces against the full range, from high-end warfighting to the specific actions that it is asking the forces to undertake. And NATO has has, in my experience, a good understanding of the strengths of the forces that are allocated to it by the nations.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Could I turn to pick up a question that General Sanders, you referred to a moment ago, or rather a point that you made in answer to a question from me. You said readiness, well, readiness for what? And that possibly is at the heart of everything we're looking at in this inquiry. And of course, we will all understand that there are different potential scenarios. You could, on one level, have everybody stood up and every tank ready to go all the time. You could have every Typhoon ready to go at the end of the runway all the time, but it would burn the force out and clearly be massively expensive. So the question is, ready for what? And would you agree with a general statement that what you're ready for depends upon your general attitude to risk? How much risk you're prepared to carry as a country?
So it's probably worth me just spending a moment describing the process of analysis, which will lead to the conclusion that fundamentally it is as you describe. It's ready for what, and how much risk do we carry, and how much risk are we prepared to carry. So we will start...
Forgive me for interrupting. I think I'm about to ask you that question anyway. I just wanted to understand, as an outset, do you agree with that general principle?
So I would frame it in the sense that military operations are never risk-free. We set a policy which describes what it is that we would expect the armed forces to be able to do in order to meet the political intent. And we conduct a series of war games and assessments. We produce a thing called the Defence Capability Assessment Register, which identifies what risks we might carry against a set of scenarios that we might face in the future. In the nearer term, we have a thing called the Capability Readiness Assessment Framework, the CRAF. That assesses the readiness of the forces we have today, and we look at two different perspectives on that. Readiness to operate, so that's to conduct routine operations around the world, and readiness to warfight, because we recognise that risk you might carry for warfighting will be different to the risk you might carry in terms of your ability to operate around the world. And those assessments will drive our prioritisation of decisions when we come into defence reviews or whatever it might be.
General, I'll come to you in a second, but that's at the heart of this matter. How good do you think the MOD is at differentiating between, let's say, three broad scenarios of air policing, peacekeeping operations, through to peer adversary warfighting, through to unexpected events, such as we've seen recently in the Middle East? Three broad scenarios. That's at the heart of it. How good are we actually at differentiating between those?
So we explicitly and specifically look at all three of those scenarios. So we would consider full-scale warfighting as the most demanding. We might describe an unexpected event as a medium-scale operation which would require deployment, which we'll look at that as a specific example. And then routine operations, whether that be air policing, whether that be a deployment of the offshore patrol vessels into the Pacific, those are looked at as well. So those three scenarios that you describe are exactly the way in which we look at the potential requirement for deployment and use of our armed forces.
Thank you. I'll pick up some more of those points in a second, but General, would you like to add to that?
So I don't think I'd add much to what Rich has said, other than the nature of the operation or the task that you're going to undertake means it's always sui generis. It's always unique. So, I've served in, if you like, four armies. One that was optimized for the Cold War, one that was then optimized for interventions, starting with humanitarian interventions in Sierra Leone and the Balkans, and then expanded into interventions in the Middle East. One then reset itself for counterinsurgency or stabilization operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and became tactically extremely proficient and well prepared at it. And now an army that is optimizing for war and for war fighting. So it takes the point I'm making is that no matter, it's a much more than a mechanical or mathematical calculation of people, equipment, the stockpiles you have. It's your ability to adapt to and understand and optimize for a particular operation. And the one thing you can be sure is whatever operation you're doing next, it won't be like the last one.
Indeed. Are we quick enough at switching between one of those broad three scenarios to another, as we're seeing happening now?
So we really put a premium on agility, adaptability and agility. And they're two sort of subtly different things. It's relatively straightforward to calculate whether or not you can switch between regions or whether you can switch up and down the scale. Those are reasonably black and white answers. Tailoring a force for everything from peacekeeping operations right the way up to warfighting operations requires a level investment in training. I would say that we are as good as this as most armed forces, if not better than most armed forces in the world.
Thank you. I have one more question, and I'm just going to bring my colleagues in. The question I want to ask on the back of that, if you would both answer this, please, is whether or not there has been a rebalancing of the advice that you're giving to ministers on risk in the light of Ukraine and the Middle East.
I'll take that one first. If I give a specific, so the short answer is yes, and the specific example I would give was around stockpiles. We know that we made judgments about the likely consumption of stockpiles of weapons through over the last 10, 15 years. And what Ukraine has demonstrated is that the assumptions that were made and the risks that we were prepared to carry that judgment needed to be revisited. And that's exactly what's happening. That's part of the reason you've seen the announcement from the previous Defence Secretary and the Prime Minister and Chancellor to invest more in both replacing the items that we've gifted, but also to actually enhance our stockpiles and the capacity of industry in the UK to generate those stockpiles. So that would be an example of where that advice and that judgment around risk has changed as a consequence of what we've seen in Ukraine.
Your judgment was that there would be no peer-on-peer warfighting in Central Europe.
No, that's not right, Mr. Spillett. What I'm saying is that you make judgments around the likelihood of in terms of the rates of effort, how many weapons you would use, how quickly and over what period of time that fighting would last.
But you do that from a military exercise that 3 Div undertook with the Americans on a desktop operation. We had evidence here from General Hodges, head of the US Army in Europe, that we ran out within 8 days the Army ran out of munitions within 8 days. So if there was a peer-on-peer conflict of any seriousness, we did not have the stocks. So it was really based on a judgment of what the Russians' intentions were.
So, as I said earlier, no operations are risk-free, and as the General pointed out, that the nature and character of that particular fight will vary. And planners have to make judgments around the relative priorities and balance of risks that they carry. And the judgment, as I said, is one that has been revisited, and I have no doubt, continue to invest more in weapon stockpiles over the next few years.
I'm not sure I could add better to what Richard has said.
It is your service that, and it was basically artillery munitions, wasn't it?
You'll forgive me, Mr. Speller, if I don't go into the details of what stockpiles we hold. I can't do that here.
We know
can do it
from
in
the
private.
evidence General Hodges gave to us, and this was in an open session, that the British Army ran out within 8 days on that in that exercise.
So you know what General Hodges said. I'm not going to add to that.
Can I just ask both of you a very simple question? Given you've talked a lot, obviously, you've got some interesting things around readiness and flexibility and agility and adaptability. What keeps you awake most at night? In talk with you, General Saunders.
Very fair. Well, readiness. But I think any chief.
Well, what is it particularly?
Well, no, so let me develop it. But I think that's true of anyone who is occupying my role at almost any point in history, because you are always concerned about the unforeseen and whether or not you're prepared for it and whether you can adapt to it. At the moment, and I think the Defence Command paper was very clear about the fact that we recognise that we haven't invested in the enablers and the stockpiles over several decades, and that's why it has sought to put that right. So there is nothing more useless than a soldier with an empty magazine, and that's why I think Defence is now investing significantly in restoring those stockpiles and getting them back up to levels that will help contribute to the deterrent effect that we need to have as part of a wider NATO alliance.
So, sorry, so I'm just so what is it specifically then that keeps you awake most?
I would say stockpiles at the moment.
Stockpiles, right?
Yeah.
So I'd agree with General Patrick's stockpiles. The second thing for me is people, workforce. There was at the start of this year 1.3 million job vacancies in the UK, and a significant pull on people in the armed services into the private sector. And so retaining our people with the skills that they have and ensuring that we recruit the people we need is right up there at the top of my priority list.
Continues to be a struggle to keep on that.
It does, and it will be.
Thanks, Chair. The previous CDS, released from his constraints of office, told us there's a lack of readiness, scale and mass in all three services now. You gentlemen know exactly how volatile this world is. But I've spoken to American colleagues who are telling me they are preparing for an imminent future conflict in America, and they gave me timelines. Now, we haven't sent a carrier force out to the Mediterranean. We can speculate why that is. So is the correct focus of the MOD, is the focus of the MOD correctly aligned with regard to risk acceptance and readiness?
Could you just expand a little bit? Sorry, Ms. Atherton, just
So,
quite.
In summary, America are preparing for war. That's what they're doing. We don't seem to be doing that. Why aren't we?
And you mean specifically with China?
Just in general,
Oh, they've said
with the volatile world that we live in. They are increasing stockpiles, they're increasing training, increasing personnel, they're increasing platforms. We don't seem to be doing that. I'm just asking you gentlemen why you think that is.
So I think you could legitimately challenge whether we could have started doing this earlier, or whether we're able to do it faster. But I don't think I agree with your characterisation that we're not doing it. So the first point to make, recognising that there are black swan events out there, and you'll be the first to challenge me on it, is that at the moment we have been given an extraordinary the gift of time by the Ukrainians. And the importance of investing in the Ukrainian fight is that it buys us time for our own recapitalisation and our own modernisation, as long as we use that time. So the likelihood of a Russian, of an Article 5 operation in NATO or the Euro-Atlantic area in the next, let's say, 3 or 4 years is lower than it was. So we should use that time. So I don't think we should be drawn into the spectre of sort of fight tomorrow. We have some time. And of course the second point to make is that we fight as part of NATO. Our deterrent effect comes from being a member of NATO and not from being an exclusively sovereign force. But if I point to my own service, I took over this role over a year ago, and the first thing I set out 3 weeks after I took over was starkly the threat that we faced. I talked about how we would mobilise the army so that it would be ready to fight with what it has in the course of the next 2 or 3 years, and that is absolutely what the army has been focused on. And I can point to significant uplifts in investments in our workforce, in improving the availability of our equipment, accelerating modernisation, in significant investment in training, and increasingly, not at the pace I'd like, not at the volume I'd like, but increasingly investment in stockpiles. And I'm very happy to offer some examples of that. So I don't recognise that we are not doing anything to prepare for war.
So would you say that the British Army is proportionate to its investment, not its challenges or commitments?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
So do you think the British Army is proportionate? It is doing a good job given the level of investment? Or is it doing a good job given its threats and commitment to NATO?
So I know that the British Army is the most productive army in Europe. So we are delivering at 130% of our capacity. We're delivering the same outputs, the same levels of deployment we did from an army that was 20,000 bigger than it is now. So this is an extraordinarily productive army. Is the army ready for every single scenario and every eventuality? No. There are some things that we can deliver and do very effectively. I point to pitting and a number of the deployments that we made straight after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But we also know that we have got some weaknesses, and those weaknesses will continue to persist through this decade, and those are on the back of conscious decisions that were taken, and we're doing our best to mitigate them at speed.
Thanks, General.
You said that no operation is risk-free, and I agree with that, and neither are some of the decisions that you have to take in terms of the spending envelope which you're given. How do you think ministers understand readiness? I mean, we used to have a chair of this committee who, as soon as any natural disaster anywhere, you were calling the army to be deployed at a minute's notice, which I often used to point out to him the fact that the army's only so big. But how do you think that ministers, and certainly the Treasury, understand in terms of if you actually want to do this and keep things at readiness as you are, do they actually understand what that actually entails?
So sometimes I know that we make defence complex for people to understand, and it is. There are a whole bunch of factors that go to ensuring that we are ready to do the broadest range of requirements. My personal experience, and a number of you have been ministers around this table and I've worked with, have been very good on understanding readiness and asking for advice about the impacts on readiness of committing forces to particular operations and understanding the limitations that they have. So you'd have to ask other ministers whether they understand it. But my personal experience over a number of years of working with ministers is that I've found them to understand it.
I wasn't thinking
well.
I was thinking more Treasury, in the sense that what Patrick's just said in terms of, for example, on stockpiles, and I accept what he's saying in terms of the breathing space possibly he's got, but I mean there's a serious issue, for example, in the army around the heavy element of it. For example, I know movements being made, for example, on Challenger 3 and other things, but they're going to take time, aren't they, to actually deliver in terms of what you actually need.
Well, so if you want to talk specifically about Challenger 3 and Challenger 2, we have a three-way demand on a fleet. One is support to Ukraine, and it's more than just the 14 Challengers that we give them, because it's the stockpiles and the spares, the parts that go behind it. Yep. Secondly, it's ensuring that we have a ready fleet that we can begin to convert to Challenger 3. And then the third demand signal is on delivering the outputs, the readiness that we have committed to for NATO. At the moment, we are just about succeeding in doing that. And
That's not what I'm hearing.
so I, as you would expect, imagined that this question might come up, and I can't talk about the actual figures, but I can deliver, I can give you confidence that we can deliver the readiness that we have committed to for NATO.
By Christmas, you're supposed to have the two first demonstrators on Challenger 3. I'm told that they're not going to be achievable by Christmas.
No, so I'm hearing, well, I'm not hearing that. So I'm hearing that we would expect those two, I'm expecting to see those two prototypes at Twickenham for the Armoured Vehicle Conference in January.
You should ask some deeper questions on it.
I have. I mean, we're hearing different answers then. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Come. Richard Drax.
Just before I ask my question, can I just go back to the old chestnut with the size of the army, which is near to my heart. Are you happy, General, that the army is going to be reduced by 10,000?
I think I'm on record of having answered this one publicly. And as I said when I took over, it did feel perverse to be cutting the army in the face of a land war in Europe. But first, I guess I'd make 2 points. First of all, within a fixed envelope, or a fixed cost envelope, if you asked me whether I would have fewer people better equipped, so with more lethal and better protection, then I'll go with that. There is absolutely no point in simply increasing the size of the armed forces, or the army in particular, if you can't then equip people to fight. And so I have to make those judgments. The second points really to, I think, emerging lessons on how we fight. And you will have heard this, I'm sure, before, but how you can generate mass and lethality and effect on the battlefield is not necessarily through human waves in the way that the Russians do. It's about how you can combine those capabilities, how you can draw on the other domains and the other services to operate in a way that is smarter, and to compensate for a lack of immediate mass in a very, very highly professionalized force. You then clearly need a plan for expansion and for generating a second and a third echelon. So that is, as I think about what the future shape, size, structure and roles of the army should be, at the very forefront of my mind is not simply a larger regular component, it's how we can structure to grow in a way. I think we can draw lessons from Israel and the way that they can draw on reservists, and we can clearly point to the Ukrainians in the way that they have been able to mobilize the general population against a particular threat.
I don't dwell too much on this. Just one more point. So far as the Ukrainian war is concerned, obviously numbers of dead and casualties are kept secret for obvious reasons, but we know they run into thousands.
Hundreds of thousands.
Yeah. Now, we are told they are fighting in this new efficient way that you, I think, indicated, that a new efficient army with all the new kit we've got will fight it in a slightly different way. Can I be devil's advocate to say that may be true to a certain extent, but Ukraine is proving that even with this new way of fighting, they are still taking huge casualties, and mass is essential to fight a war for a period of time, certainly against a peer adversary, which we simply could not cope with. Despite the fact we'd fight with NATO, I totally accept that.
So I don't think it would be fair to say that the Ukrainians are fighting in the way that we would fight. And there are very good reasons for that. Ukraine has taken a conscious decision to mobilize more mature people for conflict. So the average age of soldiers on the front line in Ukraine is 45. They're protecting their young men and women for the sake of the future of the economy. That's a conscious strategic decision that they've taken. And 45-year-olds fight and behave very differently to 18 and 19-year-olds. So they are more cautious. They are having to fight to preserve the force, not to achieve decisive breakthroughs in manoeuvre. And they are also facing some of the most challenging conditions around minefields, obstacles and terrain, where, because they don't have the sort of air cover, that we could be confident. We could be absolutely confident in a conflict between NATO and Russia that within a matter of weeks, months, we would establish the sort of air cover that then allows you to operate very differently.
Yeah. Okay.
So I don't for 1 second undermine the importance or underestimate the importance of mass and being able to generate mass. I'm just not sure you need to hold it at high readiness in a regular army.
Okay.
General, thank you
Can I
very
move on
much.
to the question now, which I was delayed in asking. As well as the decision to stop providing figures on serious and critical weakness in the force elements in 2014, as part of the SDSR process in 15, the defence planning assumptions were reclassified as secret. This means there is no publicly available information on what Defence thinks it ought to be able to do, the force elements it requires to do it, and the extent to which there is a lack of manpower, equipment, training or sustainability within those force elements, creating a serious or critical weakness. Why the change?
Can I take?
We'll start off there, Marshal.
I'll take that. So this was a conversation that I had with Minister for Armed Forces the other day. Neither of us know what the change was in 2015. There may be people on the committee who know better. But exactly this issue, and finding a way to allow the committee to scrutinise the readiness of the armed forces, but not doing it in a public way that will risk our adversaries, our potential enemies, learning things that they could use against us, is exactly what he wants to try to do. And I suggest that you might want to, if you don't mind, Mr. Drax, you pick that question up with him in the session that he's got planned in a couple of weeks' time.
There are some semantics here.
Yeah.
So DPAs weren't classified; they were classified as they were confidential, which is an obsolete classification. So I suspect that might be, they're now of course secret UKIs only.
Do you think there should be more democratic scrutiny of the defence planning assumptions? I mean, or not? Or do you think, as you say, there's a risk of giving enemy information that they shouldn't have?
This is a philosophical point, which, from my perspective, is that we have to be careful that we don't inadvertently hand advantage to our potential enemies and adversaries. But it seems to me entirely reasonable when fundamentally it is a political judgment about the level of investment you make in defence, that Parliament and politicians have an opportunity to scrutinise and understand our readiness and how ready we are as a military to do what politicians might ask us to do. But the mechanism by which that is done is one that I know the Minister for the Armed Forces is eager to talk to you about.
General, do you want to add anything or not?
I suppose I would say that there are some things that we are very public about. So, for example, our commitment to NATO. We have described through the process of the NFM and off the back of Vilnius what it is that we will provide. What we don't talk about, and I agree with Rich, are what we describe as the concurrency assumptions. So, how many different things should you be able to do at once and at what scale?
Thank you. Chairman.
Thank you. Mark Francois, then Emma
Just
Lawler.
quickly, Air Chief Marshal, I'm all for not making it easy for our adversaries. But do we really kid ourselves that the Russians and the Chinese don't understand in great detail how ready we are or are not to fight? We work very hard to understand that about them. They work very hard to understand that about us. So just as one quick example, we're talking to the First Sea Lord later on in a different hearing. It was all over the internet 6 weeks ago that not a single one of our attack submarines was at sea, because all the kind of sub-watchers had seen them all tied up alongside. So isn't it true that sometimes the MOD hides behind secrecy and national security because it's too embarrassed to talk about how unready we actually are, and we pretend that our adversaries don't know so that we don't have to tell our own public?
I might have
And then the General can follow because he's grinning.
I'll have
So
a first go.
You have
Mr.
the first
Francois.
bite.
So I'm going to be, I always say not to be facetious of the committee, but I'm going to be just a tiny bit facetious. I think you're saying that Parliament doesn't know, but China does.
I'm saying China knows better than Parliament.
Right. And if...
So does Moscow.
And I think I don't accept that the MOD hides behind secrecy. I think we take operational security and secrecy very seriously. The relative judgment about how much information is provided to members of Parliament and Parliament is a matter for ministers. So we've both set out our view that it seems perfectly reasonable, given the role that Parliament has in making judgments about investment levels, that you should be able to understand the position for the armed forces. What I would say is that you, as a committee, might want to think about this in two perspectives. So one is the here and now. You can go and count the number of Type 45s that are tied up in Portsmouth, or you can go and stand at the end of the runway at Cranwell and take the tail letters down of Typhoons and know which ones are flying and which ones aren't. And that gives you a state of in terms of the actual number. But our planning assumptions, the risks, the kinds of operations we expect to fight, the policy assumptions that underpin that, and the stockpiles, that is material that actually would be really of interest to our potential adversaries, and we should do all that we can to protect that. And I'm sure the committee would support us in protecting that information. I know that James Heapley, our Minister of the Armed Forces, is looking at exactly ways to help the committee understand these things better.
But there is a case for democratic scrutiny to this committee of those assumptions.
Of course.
General.
So first of all, I don't think, with the greatest respect to ourselves, that the Chinese or the Russians spend a huge amount of time worrying about what the UK has. I think they worry very specifically about what the US has, and then I think they would lump together the rest of NATO and European powers and worry about what the compound effect of all of that is. I mean, I think the comment you were making about submarines you can extend to the land domain, which is an issue of sort of posture and capability. So it is no secret that we have given away large parts of our capability to Ukraine to enable them to fight. I've used artillery as an example. So Russia or our adversaries will know that we have got significant gaps in artillery. They'll also know what we're doing to address it, because we've been quite public about announcing it. But it's a very different thing for them to know what the level of our stockpiles of ammunition are, or our ability to draw on stockpiles.
Well, with respect, General Hodges told them 18 months ago.
Well, I'm sure General Hodges
and you haven't contradicted him, so it's not that much of a secret, is it?
Nor have I agreed with him.
Come on, Patrick.
Mr. Francois, you know well that I can't comment on our stockpiles.
Thank you. Emma Lubbock.
Thanks, Chair. Just to follow on from my colleague's question there, obviously the USA and Germany, I understand, do report their military readiness. So how are they managing the risks to their adversaries, knowing what they want to do? And why is it we can't manage the risks in the same way by making it publicly available also?
I don't know the methods that the Germans use, but I can tell you the Americans don't release details of their stockpiles. They into the public domain, which is readiness is about availability, it's about the capability we have, and it's about our ability to sustain it. But as I say, Minister of the Armed Forces is eager to find a route to help you do this.
That wasn't the case. General Mattis, when he was the Defence Secretary, went into some detail about the level of availability of fast jets and how he called on the US Air Force to move that up. They were far more open than we are.
I suggest that you raise this issue with ministers.
And the Germans have their own inspectorate to actually publish an annual report on it. Which is why you got the
It's a
headlines.
ministerial decision.
It's why you got the headlines a few years ago about how few submarines could actually go to sea, or how many few tanks they had.
Well, they can still put more to sea than we can.
We'll take that up with MinAF. Thank you, General. Thank you, Chief Marshal. Derek Twig.
You finished it?
Have you finished?
I'm done for now, yeah, thanks. No, it's fine.
You keep going, Emma.
So if we can just move on a little bit, we've obviously discussed a sort of broad range in terms of readiness, and so not so much operational now. So could you tell us, I mean, I'll start with you, General, what you've done in the last 2 years to improve in warfighting readiness?
So as I alluded to earlier on, we established a programme that we called Operation Mobilise to mobilise the British Army to make it ready for war in Europe, recognising that we had some significant gaps in our capability, because as Ben Wallace has said, and as the DCPR points to, we have underestimated in the land domain and in the army and in readiness for some time. So we are carrying a number of things that won't be a surprise to this committee. Stockpiles that are reduced, a range of equipment that is coming to the end of its life. There's a very ambitious program of modernisation that I have a huge amount of confidence in. Levels of training that were inadequate. So for example, in 2021, only 10% of the Army's battle groups did combined arms manoeuvre training. So we were coming from a pretty low base, and then that low base was exacerbated by the requirement to give equipment and ammunition and stockpiles to the Ukrainians. And I support that for all the reasons that we described earlier on. And what that programme Operation Mobilise has done is to galvanise the army. It's provided a very singular focus on preparing for war fighting, so not for operating around the rest of the world, but preparing for war. And it's catalysed a series of things. So first of all, it's provided a war-fighting headbox. How are we going to fight with the forces we have, knowing what we are learning from the lessons in Ukraine and in Nagorno-Karabakh and in other conflicts, with what we have? What can we do differently? So that provides, if you like, sheet music, doctrine for the field army to fight differently. We've got after a series of measures, in particular around training. So we've seen a 150% increase in the level of combined arms manoeuvre unit training in the army since we announced Operation Mobilise. By next year, 90% of the Army's battle groups will have gone through combined arms manoeuvre
So that's
training.
despite the amount of time you put in training the Ukrainian armed forces?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
We have trained our divisional headquarters 3div in probably the toughest trade test you can go through as a divisional headquarters, and it came out as effective, if not more so, than many of its US counterparts. We've trained at divisional level in the UK just this summer, so over 2 months we've run a divisional level exercise involving, I've got the figures here, but I'll come back to it. And then next year we're about to go on the largest training deployment that the British Army has done since the end of the Cold War. So there'll be 16,000 troops, a 3-star headquarters, 2 2-star headquarters, 2 brigade combat teams, mobilising reservists across 7 countries to test the sinews of whether or not we are ready. So we have done a lot in training. On stockpiles, we've invested on top of what was announced in the DCPR. I'm confident that we will have sufficient stockpiles for fighting amongst the brigades that will make up a division within a year or 2. So that's
a year or 2.
Yeah. So I don't want to get into too much detail, but that is within the time limit that we set ourselves. So we have done a lot, and then I could point to increasing equipment availability. Oh, there we go. So this term there's 4,000 troops, 2,000 vehicles, 40 subunits, 22 different training sites across the whole of the UK. And then on equipment, if I pointed to 2 things, we've replaced some of the artillery pieces that we've given away. We did that within 2 months, and we have doubled the amount of logistics lift in one buy for the whole of the British Army in one. So these are the measures that we have taken. If you ask me, have we still got gaps? Am I still worried? Yes, but it's not for.
What's the biggest gap you've got?
I think what I said earlier, stockpiles.
Still stockpiles.
Yeah,
But
stockpiles.
still, what is it? Can I just ask you before I go on to the Chief Marshal, the perennial question, and you've been asked this before, the ability to put out a war-fighting division, a British war-fighting division. Am I still right in assuming that you couldn't do that without the support of some of our allies in terms of 1 or 2 extra battalions to make up, for instance, it might be on artillery, to make that actually an effective war-fighting division? Is that still the case?
So we have the divisional head. So first of all, you've got to be clear about what a division is, and it is a tailorable force package, generally speaking, that combines. It's the first level at which you can do deep strike operations, you can do close operations, and you can sustain yourself. But it can range from being 8,000 strong, which is what a Russian division is, to, if we rolled out the whole of all of our warfighting capability, about 37,000 strong. So it's a very tailorable thing. We tailor it to the task, but it's also tailored by what you have available. Yeah. So, for example, in the Second Gulf War, we sent a division that consisted of an air assault brigade, a commando brigade, and an armour brigade. That is not something that Ben Hodges would recognise as something that he'd like to fight with, but it's what it is what we fought with, and we didn't do it too badly. So I can absolutely assure the committee that we can provide a trained divisional headquarters, certified and assured brigades, 16 brigade, 7 light mech brigade combat team, and an armour brigade. But there will be capability gaps in our ability to get there, in our ability to sustain it for time. Some of the gaps that we've got at the moment, some of which we would look to fill with allies.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that, Chief Marshal.
If you look at
specifically the last 2 years, what you've done to improve the war-fighting capability.
It is worth going back just a little further, in the sense that the Air Force today is a much more capable Air Force than it was 4 or 5 years ago. And we've been fortunate as an Air Force to have benefited from a significant level of investment over the last 15 years or so that has seen us bring F-35 into service, A400M into service, Voyager into service, P-8 into service, etc. And so the Air Force is a more capable Air Force and is better able to meet the threats of the high-end fight that you describe. But I'm really clear that if you look at right across the armed services, I take the Air Force specifically, over the last 25 years, we've been focused on making the Air Force efficient to deliver force-generate capability that we can deploy across the world and bring it back.
I understand all that, but the question specifically the last 2 years.
Yeah. So but what has changed is that recognition that the operating from single static bases in the UK will not be how we would need to fight if we found ourselves in a conflict in Europe. And so there's a real focus for me and for the Air Force on enhancing our operational agility. And we have a concept called Agile Combat Employment, and that is about regaining some of the skills that some of you will remember from the 1980s and 90s, which was around how do we employ our forces in a flexible manner. So we know, for example, in Ukraine, and we think that in Ukraine, a jet that gets airborne on a mission never lands back at the same airfield. And we are not configured to be able to do that. So we worked really hard over the last 2 years, and we've got a program of work to what we're describing as an ACEVAL, an Agile Combat Employment Evaluation, in the back end of 2024, where we, and leading up to that, we've deployed P-8s to Aldergrove, for example. We've taken Typhoons out of Cyprus and deployed them into the Middle East. We've taken Typhoons that were in Estonia, deployed them up to Scandinavia to develop and build those skills for our people. Well, in a longer term, what we have to make sure is we get the most out of the investment that's been made, and that's going to require some investment in spares, some further investment in infrastructure and in people. And there's a role here, I think, for the reserves as we think about what that kind of agile combat
You've still got a problem with
employment might
spares.
So if you're going to spares and stockpiles, if you're going to operate from multiple locations, then that is inevitably going
This
to
is
be
what you
more,
want.
more demanding.
You're basically saying that and I'll finish here, Chair, is that to improve your war fighting, the basic take we've got to take from what you just said is that basically more flexible in terms of airfields are used and where you
Greater
land,
agility,
but
that's
also
right.
you've got an issue around spares.
To deliver the maximum level of agility and maximum level of operational flexibility, then ultimately that will require us to change the way we operate, and that will require us to invest in spares. And it's those boring things around spares and stockpiles that are actually the thing that's going to unlock the capability.
That's
that we
hampering
need
your
in the
war
future.
fighting ability at the moment.
Yeah, so we are enhancing that as we go through.
Okay.
Thank you. Got a lot of interest in this topic, so if I could have brief questions and brief answers, please. Thank you very much, Sarah Atherton.
Thanks. Patrick, I love an optimist. And I really liked what you were saying about how you can deploy the army. But when we look at it, and I've been doing some number crunching on the MOD personnel figures they published, and these are rather dumb statistics, but for every 7 personnel leaving, they're regulars, trained, experienced, there are 5 recruited. And that number is worse in the reserves. For every 3 joining, there are 5 leaving. And this is across all services. So really, we talk about preparedness, we talk about readiness. Have we got the man and woman power to do what, you both want to do? And do they have the right skills? And are they in the right place? Because the statistics say you don't.
The assurance I gave you earlier on about was an answer to a specific question. What can we deploy now? And that is what we have at the moment. But that doesn't undermine the central point you're making, which is that recruiting and retention are both more challenging than they have been. But deal with retention first. So we are, believe it or not, on about historic averages for regular retention. Just peaking in some areas, it is worse in the reserves. And for inflow, having had very good inflow in 2020 and 2021, the cyber attack we had on our recruiting mechanism, I think, disguised a trend that was going to come down anyway. And that is what we're seeing. And it's a combination of demographics, so fewer people and fewer interested and eligible to join the army or the armed forces. What are we doing about it? As you would expect, on recruiting, a very significant effort around a new marketing campaign. We're reinforcing the marketing campaign by taking soldiers out of the field army, so it gives you an indication of how important this is to me. This is my, after operations, this is my highest priority. So 400 soldiers out of the field army to put them alongside recruiters, because guess what? It takes a soldier to recruit a solder. You need some context.
Someone said that at the time.
We
when you
changed
knew that all along.
And what we're seeing from the results that we're seeing from that are an 83% increase in expressions of interest and about a 36% increase in registrations. But it's a bit early to tell because the marketing campaign only really launched in September. So I'm not going to bank anything until December. But it tells us at least that we're doing some things right. There are some other measures, and we're being challenged by ministers and MINDPV in particular to consider what, how much further could we go, and what radical things might we put on to increase it. The thing that worries me most is about the reserves, because we are losing reservists faster than we're recruiting them, and I am. So I think we have got a very good story to tell about what we expect from the reserves and what we need from them. I don't think we're telling it very well.
So sorry, can I just quickly give you the same hard question that I gave Richard? So how can you give reassurances to this committee and the wider public that the army is fit for purpose, given the public issues around sexual misconduct at Sandhurst, which we remember is the seat of leadership development, which was replicated at Larkhill with the Royal Artillery, and yet no one in leadership or command roles in those establishments has been held to account?
Here.
That's not true of Sandhurst. So I think you know how many people were removed from the service associated with Officer Cadet Olivia Perks. So there were a number of people absolutely held to account at Sandhurst. And I can't, other than express my deep regret for what happened at Larkhill. I can't comment on the process yet because we're still waiting for the coroner's inquest, but it's not safe to say that we're not looking to hold people to account for it. And more broadly, I underline absolutely what Rich said about the requirement to drive cultural change into an army. I think we are making progress with it. It's been a very personal issue for me. You remember the very first step I took was to highlight a case of behaviour that was unacceptable and hold a unit back from operations. That unit is now a model, so it shows that you can change an organisation. But I take nothing for granted, and it requires constant effort.
Thank you. Martin, Dr. Hughes.
Thank you, Chair. Of course, readiness is not just about equipment, it's about intelligence. And some members of the committee will remember I used to go on at some length about the old Russian military archive at Shivnam. Richard, you might even remember me going on about it at some length. It's now the Russian Military Studies Centre, so I've got two specific questions. Are you able to tell us, either today or in writing, how many Russian speakers we have in the department? And where does the Russian Studies Centre, which is an extraordinary academic and research centre, where does it sit in gaining intelligence about how the Russian military structure works? Because the last time I went there, when it was in a hut with a leaking roof, they could not only tell me what city the Novichok used in Salisbury was, where it was made, what lab it was made, the floor of the hospital it was actually made in, and who was making it. And nobody else knew about it. So I'm just wondering how many folk in the department speak Russian, and also where does the Russian Military Studies Centre now sit within gaining intelligence on the Russian structure?
On the question about Russian speakers, I would have to come back to you, but the department does hold that information. I'm sorry I don't have it to my on my fingertips. Patrick and I use the product from the Study Centre and from our Defence Intelligence organisations, and I think my experience over the last few years would say that the focus and the effort put into understanding Russia and Russia's capability has gained greater prominence, and more energy has gone into it. I'd absolutely echo your complimentary comments about the capabilities that we have, because it's not the defence. We use the defence intelligence product rather than own the organisation. I'm afraid I don't know how those two elements dovetail together. But my experience has been that actually the quality of the intelligence that we're seeing is really very, very, very high, and it comes down to people with that experience, expertise, and understanding that
just
we're
maybe
seeing.
briefly, Richard, sorry, Patrick, when commander to commander level, so when a senior commander is planning for a risk assessment, a possibility confrontation, would the military studies centre, would they be involved in utilising their facilities to better understand their commander to commander, their counterpart kind of information, because it is an extraordinary facility?
So I've just asked a question of our team, because Russia's just appointed a new head of the Air Force, and I've asked for exactly that assessment to be provided, and it will be my intelligence team at Air Command which will reach out into the organisation to do that, and I would expect them to draw on that expertise, but I will test when I get back.
Two quick coders. I think nothing replaces the ability to grow deep expertise. People like Chris Donnelly is a national treasure. We need to grow more Chris Donnellys over time. But the information, the intelligence that we're gathering is as much a product of open source as it is of deep study centres. And so, or we can't and shouldn't try to replace what the deep study centre says. It may well be that much of the insight that we're gaining will come from our ability to extract open source intelligence as well.
Thank you.
Kevin Jones.
Patrick, you gave a description about divisional headquarters, which seems to be that you can deliver it, it's there, and you rightly say that under a division it can be whatever the elements are going to be. But when traditionally people think about a division, they think of all purpose, being able to do all tasks. Is that still our aim to get to that, and when we're going to get to it?
My military assistant and I were trying to remember the last time when defence could afford to have a division that was exquisitely designed for one thing, and I think it was probably during the Cold War. And since then we have deployed, every time we have deployed at divisional level, it has been a combination of what was available and ready, and what the nature of the task was, and then compensated for gaps or incapabilities by operating with other allies and partners. So the US Marine Corps was a great case in point in the second Gulf War. I don't see that changing. I mean, my aiming point is to ensure that as we get towards the back end of this decade and we go through that extraordinary period of modernisation, you've got an army that has not got two matched divisions that are perfectly mirrored and balanced, but has got the capacity, the command capacity at divisional level mirrored, and then the ability to tailor forces amongst it so that you would group for a particular task.
And that includes obviously fitting that within a NATO.
Yes. Yeah. So if you look at the tasks that we're going to take on for NATO in the next few years, next year we step up and we take up the Allied, so the land component command of the Allied Response Force. That requires a very rapid response, 360 in all of NATO's AOR. That is quite a different requirement to deliver in future a part of a corps, a strategic response corps, to either restore territory in the Baltic states or reinforce penetration on the central front. And you've got to design for, be able to balance between those two things.
So really, when we're talking about division, when we talk about deploying a division, we should talk about divisional headquarters, and then actually look at the force elements possibly being made up of UK, but also NATO.
And the most important capabilities we bring may not be infantry battalions or close combat troops. They will be first of all the ability to plug into the other domains. Secondly, our ability to provide the enablers for it. So long-range precision fires, the ISR networks that go with it. All of the electronic warfare, all the things that make it possible then for you to plug in mass from partners, because you're setting the conditions.
So it's not about the UK doing everything, it's about us making sure we've got that divisional headquarters can then, fit
Divisional
into
headquarters and the enablers, and
Enablers.
enough of a core of combat, troops to be credible without trying to emulate, say, the Polish army, because we don't need to be the Polish army.
Thank you. Richard Drax.
Just very quickly, a question for you, Air Chief Marshal. As far as our warfighting capability, a very valuable asset, of course, will be our special forces. And on a recent visit, one of their complaints, if that's the right word, not that they complain, but observations, was the inability to get aircraft, our aircraft, when they wanted it, either for operations or training, not least exacerbated, I suspect, by the loss of the Hercules aircraft, and that the RAF were insufficiently skilled at the expertise that is required, and risk averse. Can you reassure us that our special forces have your full attention, have the assets they need, and that the crews manning the aircraft can do the specialist skills that are needed?
Yes, and I'm disappointed to hear that, and that there's a concern that our air crews are risk averse. And I think there's plenty of history, and I would point to Operation Polar Bear most recently, where air crews have shown great bravery and worked very closely with Special Forces. And you may know that the Director of Special Forces and I know each other well, and spoken to him recently about the support he gets, and that has not been the story that I've heard. What it is fair to say is, as the expertise that resided on 47 Squadron, which was the C-130 squadron, which supported primarily or solely Special Forces, as that expertise transfers to A400M, to Atlas, there will be a development and learning curve as more crews with that experience can bring that to bear onto A400M, and that is a fair reflection of what will happen. But I can reassure you that our support to Special Forces is of the highest priority for us, and that our people, my pilots and crews, absolutely know what's expected of them and will deliver it when asked to do so.
Thank you. Chairman.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Air Chief Marshal. We'll look forward to picking that up with you again in due course. Mark Francois.
Joe, can I just check something you said earlier? You said that we're deploying 400 soldiers from the army to assist with the recruiting effort. That's correct. So why have we paid Crapita a small fortune to do this for us and continue to do so, and then have to supplement it with 400 soldiers because they can't deliver what we're paying them to do? Why is that?
Seeing the head of Capita later on this week. I see him once a quarter.
The corporate CEO has just changed. The previous guy, for some reason, disappeared overnight.
This will be his last meeting.
Right,
And
okay.
then they
Before he
change it.
disappears.
Well, I think he's stepped down.
All right.
So we can point to, I think, a much improved story with Capita's performance. You're right to say for much of the early part of this contract it failed, or was failing.
Yeah.
But all of the figures that we had up until the crisis that we had with sort of cyber attack and loss of data last year was we were performing, and Capita were performing and delivering, and we did not need to bring in soldiers to engage. We were hitting all of the targets and all the numbers that we needed to. Off the back of that changing picture that I've described, and we recognised that last year, first of all, we were carrying a gap as a result of that failure last year, and then we began to spot that the trends were coming down. I pulled on every lever I could, and so have Capita. So they have done a range of different things, including introducing some of the measures and the technology that they would seek to bid for into the new recruiting contracts. So they're exposing those already, taking commercial risk doing so. This is I've got to treat this as a partnership, and at the moment, Capita is a good partner. But I have to do everything I...
Very quickly, after their performance on the idea of having a new tri-service recruitment contract based on that is beyond lunacy. But can I ask specifically, are they then paying for those 400 soldiers? Well, why is it we're continuing to pay them for failing? Because they're not hitting the targets for this year that they're down to hit. and then having to put 400 soldiers in a very hard-working army, we took your points about how productive the army is, why then take 400 soldiers to supplement a failing commercial contract? That surely makes no sense.
I'm not, and forgive me, and I will come back to you on the commercial details. So I don't feel sufficiently well prepared to talk about that.
You understand the question in principle?
I do understand the question. I think you also understand that So I have to pull on every lever I can. These are not 400 soldiers all the time. They're 2 surges, and this was a plan that was developed in concert with Capita, and they have been a good partner for the last few years. I will come back to you on the commercials.
Okay, you might also cover whether or not they're giving us any kind of rebate. Coming back quickly to the divisional HQ, it's been well covered already. But if we understand you, what you're saying is we can provide a warfighting divisional headquarters and some brigades. Traditionally, it would have been 3 heavy brigades in a division, but you're going back to the Cold War there. And we couldn't really do that now, but we could do a divisional HQ and a mixture of other brigades, and that could fight tonight.
And some enablers. But there will be some gaps too.
Yes, okay, but that helps to know. And then can I, in that case, as you've covered that, can I just switch to the Air Chief Marshal? We went to Lossiemouth. Some of what we saw was very impressive. Some of what we saw was very worrying. I think we have no doubt that everybody there, if the balloon really went up, would perform amazingly. What I think worried us was how much of what they've got they could put in the air. And you're going to have this ACEVAL exercise towards the back end of next year, if you like, to simulate a peer-on-peer conflict. Why aren't we doing that this year? Why do we have to wait a year to run a warfighting exercise like that?
So we will run warfighting exercises. It's sometimes the Americans describe a crawl, walk, run approach. There's incremental components to it. That's why we deployed the P8 to Aldergrove earlier this year. That's why we're deploying Typhoon into Scandinavia. We deployed F-35 to support the German NATO air defender exercise. So these ultimately come together into an overall evaluation exercise. But developing these skills in an incremental fashion is a well-tried, tested approach.
But with respect, Chief Marshal, the Japanese didn't invite the Americans to do a crawl, walk, run at Pearl Harbor. They just attacked them out of the blue and delivered a gigantic blow, right? After what's happened in Ukraine, shouldn't we shouldn't be crawling or walking, we should be running now. And what we saw at Lossiemouth wasn't running.
Could you just expand on that for me? I'm not quite sure what you mean.
Well, if you want me to, in open session, to go into it about how many aircraft could fight tonight, I'm happy to do that. But then you'll come back and tell me that we're spilling the beans. Yeah. Suffice to say, the numbers were insufficient.
Yeah, okay. So we lived in the UK for 10 years without a maritime patrol aircraft when we retired Nimrod.
Yeah.
P8 was brought into service from a decision in 2015 to actually in service in 2020. The capacity and capability of that force is building as we grow the number of crews, we increase the stockpiles of sonar buoys, and we improve the availability of that force. The focus on us being able to do that is relentless. The ACEVAL is about how we deploy and employ that in a more operationally
Just to
agile
save you time,
fashion.
I don't wish to appear rude, just to save you time, I think it's fair to say P8 was not the worry bead. That was really impressive. The worry beads were Typhoon availability and the continuing delays on E7. Those were the real worries.
We have a gap with E7. We have a gap in airborne early warning capability, and we've talked about that on a number of occasions in this
And it's
committee.
still slipping to the right, isn't it?
So the date of its in-service date and its initial operating capability date will be confirmed when the full business case comes forward, but there are clear signs that Boeing is unable to deliver against the timeline that they had set. So we continue to drive Boeing and the supply chain to deliver the capability as quickly as possible. I'm acutely conscious of the fact that we don't have an airborne early warning capability right now, and I want to see that in service as quickly as we can possibly make it.
For the record, then we wanted at least 5. We realised the decision for 3 was ministerial, it wasn't yours. So we're not going to beat you up on that this afternoon. But we are very concerned about the delays. You know, if it is only 3, then being late is even worse. What are you actually doing with your DNS colleagues to press Boeing to hurry up? Because the gap is now, given what's going on in Ukraine, unacceptable.
So in running the programme, as the senior responsible owner who works for me, we have one of the best SROs in defence, and he's a scary individual when it comes to driving both Boeing and DNS to deliver the capability and the performance that is required. There's a whole range of problems. There's no one silver bullet, magic wand that you can wave over this. This requires us to drive Boeing, for Boeing to respond by driving their subcontractors, and for us to work really tightly with the likes of the Military Aviation Authority, because certification will be a challenge and has been underestimated.
If it's that scary, what's the IOC then?
So I'm expecting it to come into service in 2025. The precise date around that will depend on
service.
Bring into service and deliver an initial operating capability shortly thereafter. But when I give you a date, Ms. Francois, what you'll do is you'll kind of come and say, right, you gave me a date, you were wrong. What I'm telling you is that's what I'm planning on, and what I'm expecting is over the next few weeks for the detail around what that plan for delivery is, so that I can have assurance about the date, so we can plan against that date.
I'm not trying to last word. I'd much rather you just gave us a date and kept it. It's a much simpler way to do it.
Francis.
Anyway, Chair.
We'll be picking that point up with you in due course.
Is it Boeing's problem?
Yeah, fundamentally. I mean, Boeing took on a contract to deliver a capability in a timescale that they have been unable to do so. I'm not suggesting that the MOD is perfect in every way, but fundamentally, we need to deliver the project.
I found it very interesting because Mr. Speller and I visited Boeing during the summer.
In America or in the UK?
No, in Birmingham, to see and it was interesting that everything was tickly blue according to them.
I was very recently with the most senior person in Boeing who deals with this, and he's absolutely clear that this is not tickety-boo and needs to be driven hard.
Why don't you swap?
Mark can have Emma first.
Thanks, Chair. Just a really quick one here, Chief Marshal. In response to my colleague there, did I just hear you say that you'll have a date very soon?
Right.
Can you then share that with us when you have it then?
Yeah, of course.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Mark?
I was just going to say, why don't you swap? Why don't you get Patrick to go and beat Boeing up, and then you can go and talk to Crapiter, and we'll see if either of you has it all luck the other way around. Yeah? Because I'm sorry, Richard, it's not acceptable. We've taken the E3s out. We've got, we knew that the department knew they were taking risk, but they didn't know they were taking this much risk. This is about the defence of the realm. We've got to do better than this.
I agree.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we'll look forward to that date and to picking that up again with you in due course. Thank you. John Speller.
Yeah, just as an aside, you mentioned Chris Donnelly, but my recollection is that Chris Donnelly and the Russia watching section were basically pensioned off.
Yep.
And that section broken up in a absolutely catastrophic decision that greatly weakened our ability, not so much just to acquire information, but most importantly to analyse it. I just mentioned that in that context. The next question was going to be, what's your assessment of the levels of sustainment and logistics support available? And in a way, by your reference to stockpiles and to gaps, you have answered that. But surely the key to this is the ability to resupply. And, this is recognised all the way through NATO as a result of Ukraine. What are we doing in order to build that resupply network and maintain it?
Want me to start or Ed? So I think this is one of the most, it may be dead obvious to historians, but this is one of the most stark lessons that we can draw from the Ukraine war, is that our historic approach to logistics, particularly on land, which have involved long lines of communication, logistics dumps, big central depots, large field hospitals, simply doesn't work. And one of the biggest challenges we've got is how we then address that challenge. How do you distribute logistics in a way that it's small enough to be survivable? How can you maneuver on multiple routes rather than a single resupply axis, and yet not run into potentially civilian traffic or refugees and all the congestion that goes with warfare? These are really hard challenges. And the biggest thing it points to is, and Richard was getting at this in one of his earlier answers, is that we have optimized for efficiency, and we now have to optimize for resilience and credibility. And that means building into our resupply and our logistics the sort of resilience that is necessary, which is going to mean a very, very long-term commitment to growing stockpiles and spares, and ensuring that our relationship with industry, both here in the UK, but also friendshoring, to use the term, means that you've never reached the end of a supply run. It's constantly growing. It's always on. Now the DCPR points to some of this. Is there sufficient investment? I mean, no, because there never can be. I mean, we're coming from a pretty low base, as some of your early evidence hearings were turning to, but this is a start.
So why did it take a year to place the order for resupply of 155mm munitions, which is being used at a massive World War I scale in Ukraine?
I was not involved in that decision making, Mr. Speller. I don't think I could comment on the intricate negotiations between British Aerospace and the department. I'm just glad that
worries me even more. Here we have the head of the army with an absolutely crucial component, and not being involved by the department in the necessary reordering of such equipment.
I'm not saying that,
such supplies.
I mean, there will have been advice provided from the Army into the head office. I wouldn't normally be sitting in detailed meetings around contract negotiations, but I think what I could point to is that there were successes in early procurement. For those early contracts for replenishing the stockpiles, you can point to some very quick decisions that were taken. The decision around British Aerospace, I think, revolved around, and where we would place that contract around, frankly, I think it was about cost share, about an additional plant.
Indeed. Thank you very much.
Emma Lilbuck.
Thanks, Chair. Just wondering, you've both touched on reserves already, but I was curious to know from each of you, how do reserves play a role in your assessments of readiness in your service?
So the model across the three services is different. So in the Royal Air Force, our model is, although we're built around a number of squadrons, most of them are not designed to be mobilised as a full squadron, but instead to provide trained people to reinforce our delivery of outputs. To give you some idea that in terms of train strength, we're a little bit under 2,000 at the moment from a Royal Air Force perspective. I think there are opportunities for us, and I have an intention to grow the size of our reserve forces, notwithstanding some of the difficulties with recruitment that Patrick describes, to do two things. One is to help provide capability in new areas of technology. So, for example, space, cyber, where those skills are practiced and used in the private sector, commercial sector, but which we can then use in the military, into the Air Force. And then the second thing for me is that I described this idea of agile combat employment. That is where we will disperse our forces in airfields around the world, move them regularly, and as I said, that I think will require, my view is that will require more people. But we won't necessarily want to hold those people 100% of the time. And so the reserve, it seems to me, offers an opportunity to do that. And so I can see a path through to 50% increase in the number of reserves in the Air Force over the next few years as we develop that capability. One of the other things about the reserve for the Royal Air Force, which is I'm very proud of, and I'm very proud of the reserves who serve, is that of the something like 75,000 reserve service days that we use each year, about more than half of that, 55% of them, are actually delivering operational outputs. If you go to Brighton Alton in the Chair's constituency, you'll see reservists on shift supporting the delivery. So they're getting training and they're supporting the delivery of our outputs. So I do think the reserve is a really important part of our workforce mix and capability as I look to the future.
General?
So regular armies start wars, reserve armies end them. It's true of any war. So the idea that you could design an army that is exquisitely for one shot and then not have something behind it is complete nonsense. That doesn't mean that you can't have reservists in that first echelon in a way that Rich was describing. They play an absolutely critical role because they can bring some specialist expertise. We need to get better at, for example, having sponsored reserves. So we have a particularly effective contract with our heavy equipment transporters, the tank transporters, where that is a blend of reservists who do civilian work, and then we can call on them whenever we need to. And we should be looking at more of that. We also need reservists, not simply to ensure that we have got a viable second echelon force, but also that we can defend this country as well. And, you know, as we get into an era of much more peril, then thinking about civil defence and the defence of this country will, I think, come back to the fore again. But it's also about ensuring that we get much better at tracking what we call our strategic reserve, our regular reserve. So these are people who have done regular service, then leave. You would think in any other country that is a pool of forces that you can call on and they are liable. In Finland, they can deploy 250,000 like that, in 8 weeks. We don't track them. It can't be right. So we put that right, or we're putting that right. And then this is about making sure that it's just easier for reservists to train and to stay. So I have removed equivalence between regulars and reservists. You couldn't possibly hope to command a Challenger tank in the British Army as a reservist unless you had been a regular. We're setting unrealistic demands on reservists. So let's ensure that they are fit for what they are, trained for what they need to do, and remove some of the bars to that. And then finally, the way we account and the way we pay for our reservists isn't right either. So we hold ourselves to what we call PIDs. These are the individual posts that we pay for as an army. That's nonsense when it comes to reserves. We should just grow reserves at a capacity we can. And I have a link with a reservist unit that I'm very proud of, and the Colonel Commandant of the Honourable Artillery Company, and I've told the commanding officer just to grow and grow and grow and not let anyone else stop him. And we've got to make sure that gets easier across the army.
So in terms of what you've both said there, you're both saying you want to increase reserves to improve readiness. So are we not as ready as we need to be then if we're not increasing reserves?
The point I was trying to make was that we are that we have spent 25 years optimising for the delivery of the kind of warfare we saw from 2003 to 2015. And the war in Ukraine has really shone a light on the vulnerabilities and challenges around resilience associated with that kind of optimisation, which was exactly the right thing to do at the time. What I'm talking about is evolving our capability to be better able to meet the kinds of threats and challenges we're facing in the future. And you cannot do that overnight. You can't do that overnight. And so what I'm describing is an evolution of our capability. And some of it starts with very simply getting back to doing some of the things that we did in the 1980s and 1990s in terms of the style of deployment and activity. Some of it will inevitably require investment in people and equipment and potentially infrastructure as well. We need to work through what that is, and then judgments will need to be made on the relative priorities of that alongside other things in defence and other things in government.
Gavin Robinson.
Thanks very much, Chair, and good afternoon to you both, gentlemen. Neither of you mentioned Lord Lancaster's report in 2021, though you talked of challenges and you talked of the aspiration for change.
Right.
Neither of you mentioned the Defence Reserve's transformation, RF30. Neither of you mentioned the Reserve's roadmap that was announced by the Minister a number of weeks ago, 26th of October, I think. So how are we, whenever we're trying to just get an assessment, not only of where we are, but in recognising the challenges and the efforts that will or should change them, how do we assess how well we are doing, knowing what we know, that there was the identified report in 2021 and further updates since? How can we track that progress positively? Because whilst, yes, you're identifying the issues and the aspirations, there's no sense of whether that bears any resemblance to what we know from 2021, the Hawthorne-Thwaite report. Hawthorne-Thwaite. So can I ask you to put some more meat on the bones of your response? We don't want to know that there's a problem or that there's a plan to get there, but how we can associate that with all that we have seen publicly announced and laid before us.
So what I described in narrative terms is everything that Mark Lancaster's support set out, the RF30 plan that flowed from it intended, and then the revitalisation of that through what the Minister described the other day. And I'm lucky because General Lancaster is now my Director of Reserves for the Army. And so he's both responsible, he's poacher-turned gamekeeper, he's got to deliver this, but he's also incredibly useful in terms of challenge inside the Army Board and the Army's decision-making processes, and he's providing plenty of it. I don't think I can give you a procedural answer to that question, but I recognise what you're describing. If the role of the committee is to track and hold us to account for what we've said, I think we need to do better by giving you some milestones, some targets, some indications of progress. And so rather than waffle, can we come back to you?
Yeah, I think that'd be very useful. And even if you take the statement from the 26th of October, go back to 2021 and tell us what has changed in that 2-year period, and then how you are going to mark progress in future months and years. That would be useful. And I think that saves Richard in response.
I would agree exactly what Patrick said. What I described is the input that we made to Mark Lancaster's work and report, but I think you raise an excellent question in terms of how we set that out, both internally and externally, to demonstrate that we're making progress. That's a good question.
Thank you. Well, I'd be grateful, yes, if you would follow that up as requested. Thank you. We're very nearly at the end of our time. Can I trouble you for another few minutes just to cover off the last couple of questions we have? Thank you. Martin.
Well, thank you, Chair. Patrick, I thought it was interesting you mentioned Finland, a great country, 5 million people. Very different, though, because if you're not in the regulars, then everybody else is technically a reservist. The nation has a duty, that whole societal approach. But I maybe want to dig a wee bit deeper with the reservists that we have at the moment. And where you were mentioning you were on a recent visit, and no, sorry, I think it was Richard, you were mentioned you saw a regulars reservists getting trained, but doing kind of regular work. This is where I think we get a wee bit confused. But are we seeing more reservists doing more regular work? And if so, do they have the same rights as regulars? Because I do have some concern that some of our reservists are doing stuff, like in offices, etc., but they're not necessarily getting the same rights. For example, sick pay or sick leave. So if they've been there for quite some time, and it's more or less become a regular job, even though they're still reservists, they're not getting the same rights as those they work alongside.
Let me just give you some numbers. So the RF since April 21 has mobilised 671 of our reservists, and as I said, when they're doing their reserve service days, more than half of those are delivering real output, and we're combining that with training. I'm not concerned that we are somehow substituting for regulars with our reservists. I think actually the balance feels just about right. Reservists want to be employed and engaged. They can add value to delivery, and they can potentially ease the burden on somebody else who might have to deploy. Your specific question about employment status, I'm afraid I would have to take advice from the lawyers on what the precise elements of that. I imagine Patrick would say the same.
I think that's a fair assumption. Can we come back to you on the terms and
Yeah,
conditions?
the
of
terms
service?
and conditions, I think, for reservists there are concerns that I'm hearing.
Okay. Grateful for that.
Thank
Thank you. What effect have MACA requests had on readiness? General first.
You're asking now or historically?
Well, in recent past.
I mean, historically, it has an impact. I mean, we could point to the Second Gulf War when we were involved in Operation Fresco, which was covering for the fire brigade, and that limited the number of troops that were available for that deployment.
I
And
mean,
that's just
readiness
right.
now really is.
Readiness now
has
has got, in lots of levels, it's got much better. So, for example, the demand from Operation Tempera, which was the backfill in the event of a terrorist incident, has dropped down from 10,000 to a tenth of that now, which I think is a relief for us. And by and large, we can mitigate and manage the demand for MACA. We would clearly prefer as a department that we were only tasked to do things that only soldiers, sailors and aviators can do. Thank you for that. But we also recognise that in times of national crisis or emergency, sometimes our ability to provide command and control, specialisms and mobilise mass rapidly is something that you have to turn to.
Chief Marshal.
So, about the turn of the year, there was 692 people either employed on a MACA task or stood by to go onto a MACA task. I mean, that's kind of 2% of the Air Force in round numbers terms. It really depends on the scale and duration. If it goes on for a long time or there's a large number, then inevitably that would have an impact on our ability to force generate and therefore on our readiness. So far, I would say that the MACA requests that occurred at the tail end, I can tell you they didn't result in us down declaring capability. But if it goes on a long time, or as I say, at a large number, then I would start to get concerned. And ultimately, we would have to say that would require us to down declare some capability. And then it becomes a choice around relative prioritisation. But generally speaking, we are able to manage it, and we try to bear down on the MACA requests as to a sensible level.
Thank you. Final topic, Mark Francois.
Thank you very much, Chair. Gentlemen, the integrated review at its heart has a concept of smaller armed forces, but those which are much better interconnected so that you get a force multiplier effect. But that whole concept hangs on those systems existing that allow all these different units to be able to communicate effectively. So if we look at the Army to begin with, Bowman is approaching obsolescence, though we're trying to extend it. The system that's meant to really allow this greater connectivity is Morpheus. That's years late. The IOC is classified, but it's now into the next decade. If we can't make these things work, the integrated review starts to disintegrate. So how, in the Army's case, General, are we going to get round this?
So Morpheus is one component of our ability to exchange data between platforms and to connect sensors, platforms and decision makers. It's not the only one. And we are already able to share data between satellites, between aircraft, between helicopters and between effectors. So last year we trialled a US Air Force aircraft to a UK MLRS, and one triggered the other, and there's no reason why we can't do the same thing ourselves. This year we'll do it with satellite data. So am I happy about the progress of Morpheus and where it's got to and the position we find ourselves in now? No, I'm not.
Well, for the record, neither are we.
Of course I'm not. But I also don't buy that not being able to do Morpheus means that we can't fight, and we can't fight in an integrated way. and the extension of Bowman and BSIP 5.7 particularly will allow us to employ those and deploy those combat teams, those brigade combat teams. It just won't allow us to expand and do the things that we would like to do at the rate that we would want to. I think that off the back of what we describe as the Enterprise Design Authority from Strategic Command, which sets the standards, the architecture at which the services need to be able to exchange data and information, that is moving at an appropriate pace.
Just to push back a bit there, General, that Morpheus at the tactical level, on the battlefield level, is still meant to be the fundamental system. There are other higher formation systems, as you say, but BSIP 5.7, so we're going to try and upgrade Bowman to keep it running. But the reason we're in such a mess with Morpheus is because we got into an endless dispute with General Dynamics, and it's General Dynamics who were doing the BSIP 5.7 upgrade. So they've still got us over a barrel, haven't they?
In the absence of having Morpheus, we are using multiple different bearers and multiple different forms of software to be able to exploit and exchange data and indeed compress data. So the stuff that we're doing in Ukraine, which allows us to operate in GPS-denied environments where we can extract live video feed, compress it, and then share it with people on the battlefield who can then affect it. Now, I can't talk about the techniques behind that, but the failed procurement of Morpheus has not impeded progress in other areas, and we're working around the obstacles.
Okay, so you're trying to come up with some workarounds.
Yeah.
All right, so for brevity, Air Chief Marshal, I'm sorry again, but by the same token, Wedgetail's meant to be your great eye in the sky. It's meant to coordinate air combat. It's got people on board specifically to do that. It's a similar problem, isn't it? Without that capability, you can't fight as well as you should do.
I think it's fair to say without an airborne early warning and control capability, you can't fight as well as we'd want to. And I'm on record of saying that in here. If I may, Chair, just for a moment, and I recognise why you did it, Mr. Francois, you jumped straight to the technological solution. Multi-domain integration is much more than that. It's about training together. It's about making sure we develop our commanders at quite junior levels to understand all 5 domains and operate. An element of it is how you connect them digitally, and an element of it is the sensors and capability you put into that into the battle space. In the Air Force, we've developed a program called Nexus, which is a really innovative way in which we can exchange information, agnostic of bearer, agnostic of where that information came from in the first place. And that's been developed in-house and offers huge opportunities for us to improve the level of connectivity. But I just reaffirm my point that, or restate my point that it's not just about technology, although I absolutely accept it is important.
I think we get that, and it's partly conceptual, and it's
Yes,
how
it
you
is,
think
exactly
about
right.
fighting. I think the committee, to be fair, you have a fair point, Sir Richard, but at the end of the day, at the heart of it, unless all this stuff can communicate effectively, then that whole force multiplier concept that lies at the heart of the integrated review doesn't really work. There's a fundamental, there's a lacuna in the whole thing. So for brevity, perhaps, I think the Chair wants to conclude, we've gone over the 2 hours and you've been generous, but do you accept that unless we can get the technology to work properly, the integrated review is wobbly?
No, I'm not sure I do accept that at all. There'll be gaps in our capability, like E7 until it comes into service. But there are already lots of ways in which we are able to exchange data and information across our armed forces. We will need to enhance that and improve that. But I'm not sure that the whole integrated review hinges on whether Morpheus comes into service or E7 comes into service. I'm sorry.
Well, I'll have one more go. The whole concept is we have smaller armed forces, but they can communicate far more effectively as a force multiplier. And we're discussing the fact the Army's having to come up with workarounds in order to communicate, and the Royal Air Force is having trouble doing it because some of the critical systems are late. So I'm sorry, I'm going to push back on you. At the moment, the theory is great, but the practice is lacking.
I will push back on your pushback and say that we are able to deliver multi-domain effects and we continue to do so. If I go to the Middle East, you go to a KOC there, you can see this happening. Space, cyber, air, land forces being integrated together. So we can do it.
All right,
Maybe
we'll
a
dig into this another
maybe a
time.
multifaceted answer, and we'll
leave it there.
analyse that. Final question, Sarah.
Super quick one, Richard. Can I have a progress report or an update on the carrier-borne 619 squadron?
You mean 809 Squadron?
809,
Due
yeah.
to stand up in December this year.
December this year.
Correct, yeah.
Thank you.
And to be really clear, that's a stand-up and it will grow and it will not be a full operating capability until we come back from the carrier strike group deployment in 2025. That's been the case all along, but just to be really clear to the committee, that's what's happened.
Thank you.
Thank you. Looking to the future, a good point to end the session. You've been very generous with your time, General Air Chief Marshal. Can I thank you for coming and answering our questions? General Sir Patrick Sanders and Air Chief Marshal Sir Richard Knighton, thank you very much indeed. Order. Order.